I like the questions that were coming up earlier so much that I'm definitely going to talk for a bit shorter this time, so to give you more time to contribute. That reminds me of my California story. The first time I came here, I got back to the common room at my rather superior college in Cambridge, said I'd been to California, a lot of eyebrows were raised, California. And I said, yes, it's quite wrong to suppose that Californians are a bit eccentric. They're perfectly normal, just like me. And there was a lot of hollow laughter. Our second topic is the outsidelessness of life, a phrase that came to me in the mid-80s. I'm an old man in a hurry. I only started to do interesting original work just before 1980, when I was already 45, and since then I've been in a great rush to get as far as I can before blowing up, or perhaps as well as blowing up. The outsidelessness of life, which you might compare with the outsidelessness of the universe in modern physical cosmology. There is nowhere prior to the Big Bang, just as there is nowhere north of the North Pole. There's nowhere outside the universe. By the outsidelessness of life, I mean this, that life is an all-embracing continuum. It includes all our knowledge, all our philosophies, all our faiths. It's bigger than all of them. Nobody, says the film actor Elliot Gould, in a phrase I noted down with some enthusiasm, nobody is bigger than life. Life is all-inclusive. And the argument for its outsidelessness and for my brand of what I call empty radical humanism is this. We invented language. We evolved amongst ourselves out of our need to communicate with each other and our intense sociability. We evolved the entire world of linguistic meaning. We are the only language users, and only we build a picture of the world. There is no world but our world. No other being forms a complete world picture, sets the world in order, describes it all, lays down laws for it and so on, in the way that we do. The world is ours in a very strong sense. Our language is as much ours as our own bodies are. And the world we build around ourselves is also ours. We should therefore not be afraid that there's any point of view or any malin génie, evil spirit in Descartes' nightmare, that can somehow demonstrate that our construction of the world or our language or our values are radically wrong. We should be confident in our world because it isn't anybody else's world. Our world is de facto the world. We are inside a world, as it were, that we have blown up around ourselves, and it has no outside. This is what I mean by non-realism, because it implies the end of the old contrast between appearance and reality, imperfect, partial, inconclusive human knowledge, and the real truth of things out there. It was Nietzsche who first saw these radical implications of the emergent, late modern human worldview. They are very radical, but they're also rather encouraging. I sometimes call this the gospel of outsidelessness because it means, in St. Paul's phrase, that all things are yours. We're not going to be robbed of our values or our world. In philosophy, ordinary language itself is rather more radical than you might think. It accepts, for example, the end of metaphysics or Platonism. Heidegger used the two words more or less interchangeably, causing a bit of confusion. And it's Heidegger who says that it was Marx who first understood how profoundly human and historical everything is. But in ordinary language today, we have the same insight expressed for us with marvellous simplicity and clarity in John Lennon's phrase, above us only sky. Write it down, it's beautiful. Above us only sky. Or again, ordinary language accepts perspectivism. That's to say, we all have different angles on the world, and our conversation is a search for consensus all the time between our different perspectives. Think how in ordinary language we ask other people how things look from their point of view. How does it seem to you? How does it look from where you are? That's how I see it. How do you see it? Ordinary language is full of that sort of phrase. And in the last 10 or 15 years, we have come to use the word perception to mean interpretation. A very striking shift. I think it began in this country when people began to say that the Chinese perception of the whole issue of human rights is different from the Western. Well, that use of perception is quite different from the older Anglo-Saxon use. The older use was that an honest person with a clear head has a completely unbiased vision of the world. Perception was like photography. But we've been forced in the modern period to recognize that perception is always interpretative. We always construe the world in terms of our own beliefs and expectations and interests and so on. So we have come to use perception to mean interpretation. As for non-realism, the best example I found in the life books was this. We sometimes hear it said, he's had a hard life, but then he makes life hard for himself. We're aware, in ordinary language, of the to and fro between belief that it's things out there that determine the course of our lives, and realization that it's we ourselves who, as it were, give these things their power over us. I noticed a lovely example of this when I heard a sports commentator talking about a snooker match and popped it into the latest book a few weeks ago. This sports commentator was talking about a player who was playing badly. Everything seemed to be going against him. With every shot he seemed to be having bad luck. And the commentator said, when things are going like this, he must resist the temptation to say that everything is against him, that it's a matter of fate. Believe me, it's never fate, it's always you. And I thought that was a beautiful phrase, which again shows how an impeccably ordinary bloke fully understood the point of non-realism. It's never fate, it's always you. The use of supernaturalist language is so often an attempt to pass the buck or conceal the truth from ourselves or avoid accepting full responsibility. Whereas ordinary people in ordinary language rightly regard fighting spirit and courage as the highest of all virtues. It's never fate, it's always you. Beautiful expression. Now, by these simple examples, I'm trying to suggest that technical philosophical stuff, such as the end of metaphysics, perspectivism, and non-realism, are not as strange as they might seem. The ideas involved are known to ordinary people and are part of ordinary language. It's quite wrong for university academics to suppose that they exist in some kind of different universe and talk a higher language than ordinary people. Plato's academy led people to suppose that was the case, but it isn't. Very often, ordinary people are ahead of the academics, if you look at the way the language is going. That's why I'm suggesting that not just the addition of new words to the vocabulary, but also the development of new idioms is a very good clue to the way the zeitgeist is moving. Well, I've been suggesting that life is bigger than all human faiths and belief systems together, and it, as I say in a chapter on it in this, it laughs at them. By that I mean that faiths that attempt to offer a total explanation of life are all sooner or later exposed as absurd. It's notorious of feature of many ideologies that have been very influential in the 20th century, that they include what we academics call blocks to falsifiability. They've already got built-in explanations of why anyone doesn't accept them. It's resistance, say the Freudians, it's Satan tempting you, say the evangelicals, and so on. But the person who's got an all-embracing ideology always has some sort of resources available to try to protect his faith from falsification. But in fact, life is bigger than all the ideologies and we know it. That's why we are rightly a bit suspicious of religions that despise life, try to conquer it, or to escape from it, or keep it under control, or lead us to aspire beyond it. Life is all-inclusive and must be accepted as a package. Some recognition of this is shown in traditional religions, I must say, in point of view of fairness, when Roman Catholics and Buddhists both deplore courting martyrdom and excessive asceticism. Both the main Latin tradition of Christianity and the main Buddhist tradition say your spirituality should be moderate and human. You shouldn't seek martyrdom, actively courting it, and you shouldn't practice such a severe asceticism that you ruin your health. No, you should follow a middle way. So the best and most rational religions recognize that an attempt to sort of crush life is a mistake. You've got to be moderate. That's right, I think. Well, I want to draw a few consequences now from this business of the outsidelessness of life. I might say something very briefly about death. Most influential with me here was the famous sayings about death at the end of Wittgenstein's Tractatus, where Wittgenstein says that death is, as it were, a boundary to life, but a boundary we're not aware of ever having crossed. That's why he says death is not an event in life. Death is not lived through, in Latin, experienced. While we're alive, we're always in life, for we're never actually aware of having crossed the frontier. We might be getting rather close to it, but we're never aware of having crossed it. Life is, in that sense, outsideless, even from the subjective point of view. We do experience other people's deaths, and that's a terrible problem to us, but we never actually experience our own. From our own point of view, we should treat life as endless. Secondly, I want to talk about the end of the problem of evil. I think that the problem of evil has played a rather irregular part in the history of Christianity and Islam. In Islam, because God's not thought of as human at all, and is utterly inscrutable, and cannot in any way be challenged by human beings, it's not so easy for a Job figure to stand up and fight back against God. But there was some debate about the problem of evil in Islam about 30 or 40 years ago. I remember a book from Egypt called City of Wrong, I think, was it? One of the very rare Islamic books on the problem of evil. In Christianity, the problem of evil has been debated rather intermittently, but an awareness of it is quite lively even to this day. I remember there was a pop bestseller in this country a few years ago with the rather banal title, Why Bad Things Happen to Good People. Often people are too innocent about these things, and you're very surprised that people have grown to adulthood without knowing that bad things happen. But in any case, if you take the point of view I'm suggesting, the problem of evil is greatly mitigated. It's on the whole better not to complain. I've certainly adopted that as a policy in my own life. Naturally, with views like mine, I've not had an easy time, but I've never publicly complained, and I'm not going to start now. On the whole, one should try not to complain, and in the same way, one should, so far as possible, search for a purely affirmative ethical theory. One should avoid the reactive emotions of resentment, revenge, retaliation, the emotions in which one reacts with displeasure or hostility or disgust or whatever. One should try so far as possible to upgrade or revalue things. One should seek always to increase the value of life rather than to diminish it. That's why I talk about a purely affirmative ethical theory in which religious people give up the condemning, the pressurizing of others, the extreme moralism and sententiousness that has characterized the past. I'm happy to leave in a democratic society, I'm happy to lead to political debate the question of deciding what behaviours are not tolerable and must be inhibited by the force of the state. Of course there are some, but I don't think religious people should spend their time condemning others, as if that was an important and valuable thing to do. We should, so far as possible, be purely affirmative. So I've always loved the saying of Jesus, judge not. Another consequence of the recognition of the outsidelessness of life, as I've been talking about, is this: the end of seeing all of life as a quest for personal purity, usually seen in terms of keeping oneself untouched, inviolate, not invaded. A quest for a kind of thoroughgoing all-round virginity, in which one doesn't mix with others or doesn't mingle. I think that's rather objectionable and has been very extreme in the past. But human social life involves a certain mingling of identities, a certain mingling of the stuff of one's own being with other people's beings. The human self is not a thing with a very, very clear line around it that can be kept clean and polished and uncontaminated. We are our lives. We are our to and fro with other people. We are our mingling. We should have the courage to mix in with other people and not be afraid all the time of contamination. The whole idea that social life is just as such morally threatening is wrong. So I refuse to see the spiritual life as a quest for personal purity by, so to say, avoiding one's neighbour. I became aware of this when, many years ago, I studied the Rule of St. Benedict, one of the most influential documents in the whole history of Western Christianity, and saw there how sternly the saint warns monks against the moral dangers of gossiping with beggars and other poor people who come to the monastery gates. You should keep separate from other people. You should come apart. You should be separate. Another example of that, I know someone who's still alive, a lady in Cambridge, very old now, whose parents were Plymouth Brethren, but they were ordered to separate by their church and did so. It caused very great pain. One was born into exclusive brethren and the other not. But they were ordered to separate. It was horrid. But the very idea of sharp separation and keeping oneself away from others and from the mingling that life obviously involves seems to me to have been a mistake. And I've already suggested, too, that a lot of the ethic of preparing for death has also been a mistake. That's why I think Spinoza says that whereas Plato said that the philosopher is a person who spends his life preparing for death, for Spinoza, the wise should think about life, not about death. Spinoza was the first great thinker to reverse the traditional Platonic ethic. He was most insistent on the affirmative virtues, love, joy, sanity, freedom. He was also most insistent that one should think about life, not about death. I'm suggesting also, of course, that as a consequence of the shift in spirituality and in point of view that I'm describing, we should see saints and indeed Jesus himself as a role model. Notice how, in ordinary language, the phrase role model has grown up and come into common use, and yet people have almost forgotten its religious background in what was called mimesis, the imitation of Christ, the taking of Christ as your role model. And I'm suggesting also that in a life-centered outlook, we put less emphasis on theoretical knowledge, scientific knowledge, and more emphasis on religious themes and doctrines as providing patterns to live by. So we should understand religious doctrines not literally, but rather in terms of the way they shape our lives. Let me give one example of this to finish off with. I've repeatedly, over the years, been involved in controversies about the resurrection. In my very first book, I attacked the view of the resurrection as a kind of miraculous resuscitation of the corpse of Jesus in his grave. And I still say firmly that you believe in the resurrection if you're living a risen life. That's all that the idea of the resurrection can mean. And indeed, if you look at St. Paul himself, he associates the resurrection very closely with baptismal regeneration, with the believers living of a new life. And yet, amongst us, it's notorious that the resurrection is made into a test of faith, and it's always the most crudely realistic Frankenstein and his monster conception of the resurrection that is taken as a test for religious orthodoxy. Well, we should resist that fiercely. We should say that the people who want to set up hoops for us to jump through like this are quite wrong, and they themselves show that they don't understand how religious language works and what it's for. It's meant to influence the way you live. You believe in the resurrection if you're trying to live in a new way. That's it. A resurrection is a comeback. It's a fresh start. It shouldn't be seen as a miraculous resuscitation of a corpse, and St. Paul himself doesn't seem to see it that way. That suggests that a life-centered religion, such as I'm describing, will be a religion that sees religious belief less in terms of dogmatic conviction, dogmatic tenets, more in terms of living by stories. That means we've got to attack very sharply existing notions of what orthodoxy is. Well, that, I hope, has given you a little more time than we had in the first session to raise questions.
I think it's becoming fairly clear now that today's session is not four separate lectures, but it's all very closely interlinked and is moving quite seamlessly. So we can pick up questions where we left off this morning, and I'd like to take questions primarily initially from those who didn't get a chance to put one. Yes.
This relates more to what you were talking about this morning, but one of the most insidious phrases for how to live life in the United States in a secular sense is to be politically correct. And you have to be politically correct everywhere and everything.
Yes, I think this began with people like Foucault 20 years ago arguing that personal relationships are political power relationships. The personal is also political. And the whole thing escalated from there. And it strikes me that a lot of talk of political correctness is a continuation of old-fashioned Protestant bullying by other means. There's the same desire aggressively to moralise and bully your neighbour coming through. There is something slightly absurd about it. Everybody knows in the case of men and women. For example, when we hear frustrated young mums complaining about how politically incorrect their daughters are, because their daughters want to be all girly, and their boys want to be all boyish. And these very serious young parents get worried about it. Yes, I think that there's too much political correctness. It's not really ethical. It's a sort of bullying. It does reflect one or two good points. One is there's a power element very often in personal relationships, and the other is you have to bring this out into the open, see how it's reflected in our language, and often you have to change the language. So there are serious moral points involved, but I agree, political correctness can be very boring, and there shouldn't be so much of it in a free society.
I wondered if you might comment on the possible acceleration of your theory of here and nowness and life as our embodiment, as to whether or not it has accelerated due to, in part, the emergence and proliferation of so many feminist theologians, historians, and so on. I wondered what influence women who are so much embodied have on this whole theory of changing from that Platonic split to something that's much more, I may call it, holistic.
Yes, thank you. Two things. One is the emergence of mass leisure and also of retirement has made ordinary people whose lives used to be given wholly to work more this worldly in outlook. Obviously, mass leisure and retirement mean that ordinary people too have much better access to cultural resources and to pleasure than in the past. And a very good thing too, we don't see life as all hard work and death just as rest after a life devoted to nothing but work. Then your point about women and feminism, I think is quite right. That's going to be reflected in lecture 4. My own thinking has been getting more emotivist because I've become more critical of the old Platonic distinction between reason and the passions. In antiquity, spirituality was seen as a battle between the soul and the body. Reason struggled for mastery over the soul and the passions. Reason struggled for mastery over the body and the passions. That rather iron self-discipline was very strong in Roman Catholic theology right up to the Baroque and even after. And it's objectionable, and it was always more unpleasant and offensive and damaging to women than to men. and women quite rightly are leading the revolt against it now. Yes. And it's reflected in my own thinking. Oddly enough, I was one of the first people in Britain to come out as a feminist theologian as early as 1971 or 2, I forget which book. 71 or 72. Yes, I agree. With the rebellion against the division of the cosmos into two different worlds, goes a rebellion against the division of the human being into two different parts, one of which belongs to the upper world, another to the lower world. Instead, we seek a more holistic understanding of human life and human consciousness. I nowadays battle to get rid of the mind-body distinction as well. Yes, thank you. The point's a good one, but it's something that has conspicuously been made by feminist theologians, but also some of us men too.
Immensely pleased with the emphasis on life, but I note that all of us are a little species chauvinistic as we speak of humans all the time, and I would like to think of our connection with the web of life, and I'm very tickled by the word kingdom. You take kingdom and remove the G, and think of our DNA and everything else that bears the word life. We are in such a network that we hardly notice it, and I think this is one of the directions our theology should take us.
Yes, thank you. Remember that at this point, Greek has two words, zoe and bios, where English has only the one word. There's life in the biological sense, animal life, which we share with other living things, animal and plant life. And there's life in the sense of human, social, and historical life, which is above all mediated by language. I quite like nowadays to bundle the two together a bit, and I'm very impressed by the rapidity with which we're changing our assessment of animals and their capacities, their thought and their communication. I read zoology as my first subject at university, and was of the first generation that was greatly impressed by the work of Kohler, Tinbergen, David Lack, and the first generation of animal behaviour people. But that work has gone on so rapidly this last 50 years that we're quite used to the idea now that something analogous to language, and certainly something analogous to culture, already exists amongst animals. Where that'll lead us eventually, I don't yet know. It's just a rapidly changing branch of knowledge that will affect thought. I'd like to see us begin to strive for more consistency in our attitudes to animals. Which ones we eat, which ones we protect, whether there are some we should even give something like civil rights to. I'd be inclined, I rather agree with those who think we should register all the anthropoid apes because they're getting so scarce, and track them all and look after them. I think we're going to have to stop laboratory experiments, or most of them, on the anthropoid apes and a few other things. But how far that will take us, we hardly yet know. It's now beginning to be very actively debated. I'm very glad that here, as in other countries, efforts to conserve wildlife are having a lot of success. It's one thing that does actually work and is going rather well. We're making progress, but our record in the 19th century was terrible, of course. We're reversing that now. But your point is an important one. I don't yet know, I don't yet see at all clearly what its long-term implications may be.
In the old religion, one of the things people did on Sunday morning was to celebrate, praise, give thanks to God. And now I guess one of the things that could be done if there's going to be Sunday morning gatherings is praise, celebration, thanks to life. I wonder if you could make some suggestions on how concretely that might happen, and also not just on Sunday morning.
5 years ago, in the writings of that period, I was debating with myself whether to focus my philosophy of religion around the word God, or around the word being, or around the word life. As it turned out, it's been life. I did write 2 being books, and I did write the various books in which I put forward a non-realist conception of God in the 80s and a few in the 90s too. I do myself still sometimes talk to God and find myself praying, so out of long habit. I am a priest, I still go to church. But I have since the end of the 70s moved from my old high orthodox notion of God to a non-realist conception of God, according to which God is a spiritual ideal. And one can rightly aspire after God as an ideal of perfection and love and so on. And treat God as a symbol of the goal of the spiritual life. A God who's purely ideal no longer pushes events, but he can have pulling power. So I haven't yet myself formally rejected belief in God because there's a lot of elements of it in me. And I don't know what its long-term prospects will be. I think the notion of God as universal cause of all events is unavoidably in decay, partly because the modern vision of the world doesn't need a first cause in addition to second causes, partly because there's so large an amount of random in the constitution of the world. See, the idea of God is officially thoroughly predestinarian. It implies that every event in the whole of world history is controlled, pre-calculated and controlled by God with a view to the fulfillment of a single great cosmic purpose. Now that extremely unified and rationalist conception of reality seems to be unlikely ever to return. The modern universe has just got too much random in it. So I don't myself think all-out metaphysical theism is likely to return, but it may be the word God does have a future as a term in spirituality, and that the worship of God will persist. Let me come back at you with a question. Isn't it odd that a country with as vigorous a republican tradition as this still goes to church to use the language of absolute monarchy?
Just pursuing the question that has been asked, Don, do you think it is necessary, desirable, that we start finding, inventing, creating new rituals for a Sunday morning, for instance, to celebrate life? Or do we just celebrate life without rituals? Or are people who go to church on Sunday morning or Sunday evening actually celebrating life in their own way, even if they wouldn't express it in those terms?
In Radicals and the Future of the Church, 1989, I did a sort of sketch of the Church of the Future. It was a sort of Quakerism plus a memorial meal type Eucharist. And it was much laughed at, but it was the best I could do at the time. More recently, I've said that our radically open-texted and democratic non-organisation, the Sea of Faith, is a sort of rough sketch for a church of the future. I just don't know. I don't know what form will be found to work best in the future. I hope there'll be something. I hope there will still be societies, meeting places, where people can test out their religious language and evolve some kind of common vocabulary and cooperate on various campaigns and projects and good causes. So there are various uses of a church which will continue whatever happens. I'm just unsure. Notice, by the way, that the churches are trying to turn to this world. A good example of it In a European church, you're always in a kind of catacomb. You can't see out of it. The windows are all stained glass. And the pictures, the iconography you see in church is always concerned solely with the next world. Everybody whose image is in church is either dead or immortal and has always been in heaven. There's nothing of this world to be seen when you're in church in a standard traditional Western church. But as you go to New Zealand, the east window of the church that the celebrant looks through as he celebrates the Eucharist is left clear and shows the landscape. So you, at the Eucharist, while you're worshipping, you look through and see this world. And I was very tickled by that, by the newness and strangeness of it to a European who'd been brought up to think of the church as being rather like the painted interior of an Egyptian tomb. It was very refreshing. One other thing in Europe, I don't know if anybody's ever seen it here, but perhaps the loveliest building in the whole of Europe is Steinhausen. Anyone know what I mean? Steinhausen? One of the loveliest small Rococo churches in Germany, a pilgrimage chapel of the village in the Swabian Alps. Steinhausen is decorated in plaster with the animals and plants and even the insects of the neighbourhood. Most extraordinary for a Roman Catholic church. So perhaps the church can begin to shift its focus towards this world, can begin to pray with eyes open, and so on. By the way, my version of prayer is this. Instead of trying to practice sensory deprivation and shut out all external motion and sound and so on, I tend to sit and watch natural motions. I watch the clouds moving. I watch the people moving across the big common outside my college window. I watch grasses blowing in the breeze. Anything very quiet like that, a quiet natural motion. And I try, as it were, to listen to being coming forth. I try to watch the passage of time. I try to just listen to the world. I love watching gentle natural motions. That's a sort of meditation where I'm not making any pretense of trying to attend to another world. I'm trying to attend to this one.
I'd like to turn to your comments about the end of evil and the judge not. I'd like to hear some more words from you about that, because I'm still in a place where I am very aware that there are some actions and choices that we make that are much less life-giving than others. And sometimes I think of them as evil, and I do judge them. So I'd like to hear you say some more about that.
Yes, I understand you, but let me make my point more cautiously. I'd like to see us less vigilantly looking out for motes in our neighbours' eyes. They're very often Puritan communities, say here or in Scotland, have got a bad reputation for always snuffing out sins, looking for wickedness and so on. So I argued that in my view, a religious person should, so far as he can, as far as she can, be purely affirmative and see the task of recognising major social wrongs and pathology to politics and the public debate about how to limit these things. Often, evil is used rhetorically to demonise political opponents or other countries or something in a way that I would want to avoid. So I'm trying to be more tolerant. Let me give an example of the shift. Alcoholism was sin in the 19th century, was medicalised in the 20th century, on the whole with good results. Often you can treat a thing as a moral question and battle away with it, or you can treat it as perhaps a problem in psychology or a medical problem and deal with it more gently and sympathetically, but more successfully. I wasn't saying that society as a whole should not take evil seriously, only I don't want to see religion chiefly concerned with looking for other people to condemn. I hate, for example, the current violent controversy in English and American Episcopalianism, Anglicanism, over how to be sufficiently anti-gay. I can't abide that. Simply won't have anything to do with that controversy. For most of my life, happily, I was able not to worry about whether people were gay or not. It just doesn't strike me as a thing one should get unduly worked up about. You see what I'm doing? I'm not denying evil. I'm saying I want it to be less salient in our whole living than it has been in the past. It still in some places is. Are you satisfied or?
Yes, thank you. I was concerned that you weren't giving enough credence to the reality of sometimes there is evil. But
Yes.
I agree with the example
Yes.
you gave.
Yes, but we've got to be careful about getting overexcited. There have been a few cases in Britain where people have got into an almost hysterical state over things like satanic child abuse, and all sorts of evils have been done, and innocent people's lives have been wrecked by a kind of media hysteria. That's the sort of thing we should, I think, have no part in. These things matter, but we've got to be careful of a sort of mass hysteria like that happened in the days of witch hunting.
Yes, I heard you mention in your comments the word psychology. And it occurs to me that as we move from dogmatism and God out there to personal interaction and all that kind of social relationship, that we probably better use our time not studying all of this old dogma and all that, but think more about applied psychology, developmental psychology, the whole field of studying this life thing as it appears in us. And maybe we should move a little bit more in that direction.
Yes, I think more is being done in pastoral training of ministers and so on in this country particularly than was done in the past. But it's true, one of the disasters, one of the reasons for the disasters that's overtaken the Roman Catholic priesthood in the last 15 years or so has been the rather crude pastoral supervision of the clergy and crude teaching of psychology and so on, and pastoral formation of the clergy themselves. Yes, a lack of psychological sensitivity has meant that life as a Roman Catholic priest or as a pope can be horribly harsh and lonely and unbefriended and lacking in human warmth. Yeah. So I think you're quite right, and one of the gains we did make in the 20th century was improving psychological awareness. Let me put this in Foucault's terms. A gifted and remarkable man, Michel Foucault, the French historian of ideas, talked about the care of the self, and he said that Christians had tended a bit to neglect this. We conducted a kind of moral self-examination before we went to confession, but we lacked ability to care for the self in the way that pagan Romans had often done. The point is a good one. We need more psychological awareness and sophistication and awareness of others. Notice nowadays that employers are now being increasingly held responsible for protecting their workers from intolerable levels of stress and for making jobs interesting to do, so people can do them without getting damaged by them. That's a good change that is taking place.
I belong to the Santa Rosa Church of Religious Science, and we teach mostly what you're talking about, and we also call our Sunday service a celebration of life. My question is, on your outline that we were handed, you have a little quote in parentheses. Does that refer to book titles and chapters or something like that?
Oh, they're short abbreviations for works of my own. I've settled on two ways of conducting these sessions. either I read you texts that are briefly referred to there, or I talk off the cuff from the lecture notes given, as it were, and inevitably, being a gossip that I am, I've not actually read you chunks of the books. So LL is Life, NRL is New Religion of Life, AIW is, that's, now I've got it. Which one is it? WH is the way to happiness, AIW is as it was, yes. I had thought of the idea for my 70th birthday of writing a kind of manifesto or a sort of sketch of my own ideas, a crib to myself in a way, as the 70th birthday. And it was to be called As It Was in 2004, in contrast to As It Was in the Beginning, It Is Now, It Never Shall Be. I doubt if that'll get published. It was just something I did as an exercise to sum up my idea. That's all that is. But actually, although it's always less coherent, if you're in a reasonable mood, talking off the cuff can get points across better and discover areas of agreement better than reading a text. Just depends on the mood one's in.
Okay, we're coming to an end of this second session, but I don't want to let Don go without throwing back at him some of this judge not business, which has been exercising me over the last 5 or 10 minutes. Don, I was brought up in the Plymouth Brethren, and I hope that I'm no longer judging other people by the standards of the Plymouth Brethren. Nevertheless, I do find myself extremely angry and if you like, judgmental about on the issue that you mentioned of gay priests and gay bishops. This is not something that I feel I can simply stand back from and let them get on with it. I feel angry and engaged about that. Now, is that because I am still enthralled to my old Christian religion, or is it, and therefore not yet sort of fully in tune with the new religion of life? Or is there something to be said for religious people being passionately involved in these kind of controversies? And if they are passionately involved, and if they believe, as Bishop Richard Holloway has said, that homophobia is the church's way of defining sincere religious conviction, if one believes that, shouldn't one say so, even if one is going to be called judgmental?
Well, of course I agree in a way, but I very, very much wish Rowan Williams had taken a big risk and been firmer at the beginning. He should never have allowed the recommendation of Geoffrey John to go through and be approved by the Queen and so on, and then backtracked. That was a disaster. I agree that particular case is important, and that the obsessions of some of the evangelical brethren need to be opposed. Yeah. But it's just as a matter of general policy, when you change over to seeing everything as a continuum, and having a less dualistic vision of the world, you try so far as possible to see things in context, and to use persuasion and rather than confrontation as your method of solving moral disagreements. I rather wish more senior people in the Church of England had opposed the evangelicals, had opposed their interpretation of Scripture and so on. It's most unfortunate that thoroughly bad biblical exegesis and so on gets away without the bishops objecting to it. In Britain, at least, we've allowed the evangelicals to be the tail that wags the dog for too many years. Something rather similar happens in Israel when ultra-hard-line Orthodox Jews are allowed an undue influence on the policy of the whole state. We shouldn't let hardliners claim the moral high ground and have more influence than they deserve. I agree. But I'm trying to get the bitterness out of moral conflict. Over some of these issues are perhaps a bit easier to talk about. I am myself a little bit more divided. For example, abortion. In general, I'm sympathetic. I think the state should permit abortion because there are so many cases where surely it is the best option. On the other hand, as a biologist, as myself, parent and a lover of the web of life and so on, I hate the thought of aborting a healthy pregnancy, and I wonder if society could find some way of making the situation easier. And I do feel a bit divided over that one. So in some of these cases where an issue is fiercely debated, I want to deplore the conflict and the ferocity of it and use gentle persuasion. In other cases, I'm genuinely myself divided as well. Yes, I fully appreciate the problems people have raised, because I think there are no absolutes in ethics, there's only a continuing conversation.